Hi, I'm Dana Cruikshank with the National Science Foundation. Cells use certain chemical switches to communicate with one another and to perform other functions, but until recently, finding and identifying these switches has been somewhat difficult. Recently, Dr. Naren Ramakrishnan of Virginia Tech University and a colleague in India have used some novel new approaches to find and identify thousands of these potential chemical switches. Dr. Ramakrishnan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Dana.
Dr. Ramakrishnan, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your research. What did you study and why?
So, we were interested in studying biochemical switches, and they're just like electrical and mechanical switches that you use for controlling your television or refrigerator or microwave, except they're made up of chemical reactions. So, a switch is like a basic form of a memory unit. The switch is off, the unit is storing a 0. The switch is on, if the switch is on, it's storing a 1. So what we wanted to do was try to understand the cellular basis of memory and try to see exactly how cells make their decisions. And this is important for a lot of biological processes, from aging to cancer.
And how did you go about doing this research? Did you use the typical approach used by scientists in the past, or?
So we took, me and my colleague, Dr. Upi Bala from NCBS India, we took an engineering approach to this problem. So think of it as like Lego blocks. Each chemical reaction is one Lego block. So we took a lot of these Lego blocks and started putting them together and tried to see if they could behave like a switch. And what that lets us do is to sort of take an unbiased view of how switches come about. And it helps us reconstruct exactly all the possible ways in which you could design a switch.
So tell me, what does your research tell us about these chemical switches that perhaps we didn't understand before?
First, we found a remarkable number of switches. So we used to know a handful of switches before. Now we have catalogued about 4,000 plus switches. So this number of switches was not quite anticipated before. The second thing we have noticed is that these switches are actually quite related in that they form a family. There is such a thing as a simplest switch, and all the other switches are derived from this switch. And this is interesting because it sort of suggests how evolution might stumble upon a switch.
So tell me, what are some of the possible uses of your findings?
So you can use this catalog just like you would use a catalog of mechanical parts or electrical parts. So if a biologist is trying to understand how a particular system works, they can use our catalog to identify these motifs of switches and look for these motifs in their own circuit. And that helps them understand exactly how switches are used to drive the function of their particular circuit.
Now, you mentioned that you used a supercomputer to help find these switches. Why did you use a supercomputer? How did that work?
Yeah, for several reasons. So I talked about these Lego blocks. It turns out there are zillions of ways to put these Lego blocks together. And we need to identify and enumerate all these possible ways in which they could be put together. And for each of these configurations, we have to see if that can behave like a switch. And that requires a supercomputer, simply because of the explosion in the number of possibilities. So in total, it took us about 100 CPU years to complete our study. What that means is, if we were to use one computer, it would have taken us 100 years to complete the study. And that's why we use a supercomputer.
So what's next for this research? Where would you like to go from here?
Switches are like the most basic elements of circuits, but there are other complex parts of circuits. So what we'd like to do is, going from our catalog of switches, we want to start thinking about catalogs of oscillators, amplifiers, and other elements, and sort of bring the same viewpoint that an electrical engineer brings to biology, for instance. So if we have a catalog of all these biological parts, we should be able to comprehend any complex circuit in terms of all its functional parts. And that is very important because it essentially reduces the complex dynamics of cells to these simple to understand metaphors.
Well, Dr. Ramakrishnan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dana.